Thanks everyone for joining. We're so excited to have you here. This is our very first event for Austin Design Week 2021. And we're so glad you're here. My name is Maddie Huey and I am on the ADW team this year. You can connect with us and share your experiences over the week by tagging us in social media. We encourage you to do so. Please check the Zoom chat where we'll be putting that link and several other resources for you. We encourage you to continue the conversation there. And there are free events all week, so we encourage you to check those out and join us for more. And then lastly, we wanted to say huge thanks to all our generous sponsors for making this year happen. At the end of the event, I'll be posting a link to a brief survey that we'd love to hear more from you. And now I'm going to pass it over to Kelly to get this event started.
All right, let me just get my sharing set up. Okay, so first off, the boring question. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yep. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Maddie, and the rest of the team at Austin Design Week for making this presentation possible. I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned so far about strategic foresight with you all. And of course, thank you to everybody who came here as well. I'm really excited to present this. So let me start by introducing myself a little bit. My name is Kelly Tsao. I'm a UX designer, and I work at Q2, which is a digital banking company based in Austin. You might be familiar with it from the Q2 Stadium, which we sponsored. Q2 is an innovative company in terms of being able to change how we think about financial services and how financial services is performed. But actually, the content from this presentation also is drawn from my earlier background in consulting. I used to work at Accenture, specifically Fjord, their design consulting arm. And I was working on putting together a futures consulting practice there. As we go through this presentation about strategic foresight, I wanted to let you know that there are going to be these question slides. And so as we hit these interactive portions of the presentation, I would like you to just write your thoughts in the chat. We are all very accomplished people who have this shared interest in futurism. And so I would love to have this opportunity for discussion and connection between all of y'all. So go ahead and start with, is it possible to change the future? And then I'm going to go through a little bit of the structure of this talk as this discussion gets kicked off. So first, I just want to warn you that this is going to be quite a theoretical talk. I'm going to be talking through what futures thinking is, so defining it and its relationship to action or change. Then I'm going to go through some of the context, so where futures thinking came from, what it looks like in the world today. Then I'll be moving into the business case for futures thinking. So put on your mini MBA hats because I'm going to be talking about how to make futures thinking part of strategic planning. Then finally, because this is Austin Design Week after all, and I too am a designer, I want to make the connection for what futures thinking means to a designer and how I believe that we are uniquely positioned to be able to make futures thinking processes and results a reality. And then finally, I'm going to do a speed run through the process of how to be a futurist, some of the most common activities that can be done in workshops or research in order to generate the results and scenarios of strategic foresight. So hopefully that was some time to get some chat going. Maddie, what are people saying about if it's possible to change the future?
We're getting some fun mixed ideas here. So some attendees are saying, Garrett, heck yes, changing the future is what we're in the business of. Others say, of course, every small thing we do affects the next second. Yes, the future is not yet defined. We do it all the time. But some people say, no, the future doesn't exist yet, so it can't be changed. So we are getting very theoretical here.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm a huge theory nerd, so I love that. I love all the discussions so far. Like I said, I definitely don't consider myself to be an expert on this topic by any means. Rather, I'm just somebody who wants to share out my perspective based on where I am on this journey and what I've learned so far. And with that said, I also wanted to pause and take a moment to acknowledge a huge debt to my friend and mentor, Sheila Dibblebus. She is no longer with us anymore, but she was the person who introduced me to the idea of strategic foresight, design futures. And so I just wanted to take a moment to remember her as a huge part of this journey and a huge part of this presentation. She's the one with all of the real practical experience. I'm just the design theorist here. Well, definitely the pandemic has caused us to lose a lot. It's changed a lot. But another specific lens that I wanted to talk through about the pandemic is how it's been the cause of shifting trends. So it's been in all kinds of different directions. So in e-commerce, with a 77% year-over-year increase in e-commerce in the last 2 years, we've actually accelerated to projected 2024 or 2026 levels of digital commerce impact. The status quo has also just been transformed, where we reached a 56% remote work capacity. As designers, I'm sure a lot of us working in tech companies did become part of that shift, of which 25 to 30% of that is predicted to be permanent moving forward. But it's not all been moving forward into the future or transformational. We've also had a reversal to 1988 levels of employment. As you all remember, after the initial shock when many people lost their jobs, only 39% of women versus 58% of men re-entered the workforce, which of course has huge impacts for gender diversity and equity. But if we think about strategic foresight and futurism, we can think about it as a defense against an uncertain world. And that's because, as Chame Casio said, thinking about the future and doing so in a careful, structured, open, and collaborative way makes us a stronger civilization. You know, the way the world responded to the pandemic, some people had plans in place and enacted them. And then in other ways, it was just purely reactionary, which of course puts us in a more difficult position to be able to respond in the best possible way. And that's where futures thinking comes in as a way of proactively thinking about different scenarios, including black swans or completely unexpected and very negative transformational events like the pandemic. So let's start with that definition of futures thinking that I promised you. It's a practice that allows us to create, plan for, and test views of alternative futures based on present day research of trends. And that research part is definitely very key. That's a part that UX design and design thinking has in common as well. However, what futures thinking is not is that it does not attempt to predict the future. This is not a crystal ball. Rather, it creates scenarios of varying degrees of probability so that through our understanding, our research, and our analysis, we can understand how best to respond to each of those varying degrees of probability levels of scenarios. And the structure or steps of futures thinking can also be broken down into discrete theory and process. Learning, where we research and analyze signals. Anticipation, where we synthesize those signals together into trends. The innovation step, where we then prototype possibilities and create those scenarios. And then finally, a strategy, where we can plan and refine our responses to those scenarios. And it's probably the most common graphic used when talking about futurism is the futures cone, where each of those scenarios are plotted out according to the most probable, the plausible, the possible, and then finally, of course, the preferred futures. So with that super fast debrief of definition of futures thinking, let's go into what does futures thinking do? So where does it come from and what does it look like in the world? And also, how is futures thinking different from the way we think in everyday life? Well, it can be formal. So credit for originating scenario planning often goes to the American game theorist and futurist Herman Kahn. However, a form of the practice also emerged simultaneously in France in the work of Gaston Berger, Bertrand de Jouvenel, and others. And the American approach, which I'll be mostly talking about, comes to emphasize the probability with degrees of likelihood assigned to various outcomes, while the French approach focuses more on what should happen. So kind of talking about what's the preferable future. And it really is most often credited to Royal Dutch Shell, which pioneered the usage of scenario planning in the early 1970s, where as a result of the oil crisis, oil shocks, we were trying to figure out what are the different scenarios of how they come out of this crisis, just like how we are still working on how to come out of the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. As it continued to develop, other elements continued to be introduced, such as including stakeholder interests, expanding to involve strategic planning for an entire corporation, not just a smaller section of it. But this is a very formal approach, usually involves the resources of a large company with a lot of people who can be available to do that research. Another way that futures thinking comes out in the world can be more creative. So Netflix created a very popular show called Black Mirror, where the gist of it is that this is a sci-fi show, and they take trends that we can see going on today in the world, such as rating people. Everybody from your DoorDash delivery person to your Uber driver, everybody gets a rating out of 5 stars. And then also combining that with social media in this particular episode, it examines and really makes you believe in the world where this exists, where these trends have been pushed to their extreme, cast out into the future, and then follows one young woman as she navigates this world. Well, what both types of futures thinking have in common between Black Mirror and Royal Dutch Shell in the 1970s is that they break us out of our ordinary assumptions about the world. They make us think about new possibilities and look at existing trends in new ways, which also, by going through that planning process of thinking about what would happen if these trends were to push forward and grow or decrease, then that better prepares us to respond in the case that something like that would happen. Our bubble of belief forms the limits of our world, and futures thinking pushes us into that liminal space that can change the limits of our world. This concept of liminal thinking is from a book by Dave Gray, where he talks about how all of reality is actually completely unknowable. The only thing that we can go off of is our single human tiny life of experience, of which we can only give attention to a very small sliver of that at a time. Of that very small sliver of attention, it then gets filtered through all of our theories, judgments, and beliefs about the world until we finally end up with our small bubble of belief, where we're able to predict what will happen next, and we're able to conceive of actions to affect what will happen next, only based within this bubble. So pausing here again now. What do you believe about your ability to create change? I'm going to move forward off of this slide. Maddie, feel free to post this question in the chat as well, if that would help. And then I'm going to circle back around for discussion. So continuing on the track of Dave Gray, one thing that he proposes is this idea of double loop thinking, where we have needs, we go about our lives to try to fulfill them, and then we also have beliefs about the world. So those combined create our actions, which have results, and then it circles all back around. However, the benefit of stepping outside of what we believe and exploring new potential beliefs allows us to come up with a new and greater field of potential actions, which has even more number of potential results, and then allows us to potentially meet our needs in new ways. And this is also what gets at being able to change the future, because actually change is only possible in the here and now. We can't take actions in the past or the future. The way to create change is by acting in the here and now as if a different world existed. So for example, act as if the world you want to create is already here. With that, Maddie, what are people saying about their beliefs about their ability to create change?
Yeah, we have some comments in here. One is really summed up by Mark by saying it's complicated. Annie also says that it is contingent on my ability to form relationships and build credibility within the powers that be. And then Darwin says, we all have the agency to create change. We just have to contextualize that change.
Awesome. So it does sound like the overall gist of this audience is for being able to create change and for it being possible to change the future. So for any others who are not convinced yet, I want to talk about the value of futures thinking. So I'm going to go into some more theory and also a particular case study of how one particular company was able to implement futures thinking as part of their planning process. So change is constant and moving faster. So how do we take actions, no matter the field, to accommodate the pace of change? And as we're going about our everyday lives, going to work, and it can be tough to talk about what could happen next. We all have some amount of uncertainty in every decision that we make. And it can also be very stressful to be the downer on the team who is always bringing up risks, and no one ever wants to give the boss bad news. But futurism can provide a framework and a process to make it safer to acknowledge our collective uncertainty and maybe even do something about it. The scenarios are creating that safe space to acknowledge our collective uncertainty. So what feels uncertain in your world? I'll give them a moment to post that in the chat as well. For me, I consider the value of strategic foresight to be number one, a way of decreasing the risk in the decisions that we make. With the amount of change and the amount of uncertainty that there is, the ability to perceive change as it's happening is actually incredibly valuable, as well as increasing our capacity to respond to change. If we're able to both perceive and react to change in a proactive and planned out way, then we can create an intentional influence on our environment and our context, as somebody else in the audience said, by proactively building those relationships to be able to make change. And then feeding it back into both personal and organizational learning so that you can continue getting better at perceiving and responding to change. In an organizational standpoint, we can kind of think of this as innovation portfolio management. You always have many projects going on at the same time. Within my current context, we're working on many different features, some of which are solving similar problems in different ways. But we can only have a finite number of people and a finite amount of money to throw at a given problem. So how do you pick which project you're going to focus on? Futures thinking offers a lens for portfolio management for both project selection and resource allocation across multiple future scenarios, rather than using a single metric. Since, as many of us know, if we pick a single metric to measure against, it can often be the case that people are then incentivized to optimize for that metric rather than for the overall future scenario that you actually want to reach. And this could take place by identifying markets that do not yet exist. It could also help by identifying resources that have not yet reached peak demand, so that then you can continue to plan forward into the future. And another quote from a leading futures consultancy is that longer range innovation inherently has higher risk. And as a result, many companies do not invest in it enough, which leaves their brands to grow at market rate through less risky, but less rewarding incremental moves. I'm going to pause again and ask for what are the responses from the chat about what people are uncertain about?
Yeah, Kelly, there's a lot of uncertainty. Seb says the future of the pandemic, politics, career paths, a lot. Others say literally everything, how to plan life for my family and our son in the face of climate change, the direction we're going in, politics, and also new scientific discoveries. And Zoe says too many things.
Yeah, I really feel that. I mean, regarding family planning and climate change, I very much personally empathize with that, because it's even something as individual as the choice of how many kids do I have, knowing that I live in a first world country, and that has an impact. Or where do I live, because I don't know how much the world is going to keep heating up, and then maybe that means that you shouldn't live near a coast. So I don't have solutions for any of those, but I hope that some of these perspectives help you in being able to think about different scenarios and make those personal decisions. So this is going to feel like a very far away topic from all of those uncertainties. But the case study that I have to share with you is about strategic foresight at Disney. So in 2019, they did a Workforce of the Future project, where a high-level HR leader who was interested in foresight made a partnership with a foresight consultancy, and they formed regional teams of thought leaders who then spread futures thinking throughout the rest of the company. Another thing about the way that Disney approached it was that it was a global approach. So while there was a central training team, each local team was given the autonomy to go about it in their own way, which actually helped result in greater innovation in one particular region being able to spread to it. Specifically, as they were going through their research process and gathering those signals from all the different regions, the Italy team had a graphic designer on their team who took the signals and put them into cards that she designed, which she then was able to put into that central database and then allow people across the Strategic Foresight Initiative to take those signal cards and then recombine them in local workshops in order to plan out their responses. So even though this was just a single project and a strategic foresight team, it did result in some organizational culture change as well, which I think they also had a benefit in that it was initiated by HR. And then they resulted in a tagged trend database, which they called the Global Scanning Repository. And embraced a long now perspective. So, as a company, you can't invest too far into the future. It has to be relatively in the short term, like 3 to 5 years, to take action. And just for some additional context, because I realized I didn't mention this, is that the more academic version, like how the game theorists or Shell planned it out, commonly uses a time frame of 10, 25 and 50 years into the future for short, medium, and long term. So this was an innovation by Disney in crunching it down to say 3 to 5 years into the future. And the results of this project from their global scanning repository, the signals cards, and the workshops that resulted was that Disney had a revamped 5-year plan. They identified new market segments and developed new products and services, and also identified upcoming talent or skills gaps, which this project provided justification to secure funding to meet those gaps. So specifically, their key insights were the future of talent, proactively identifying and hiring for AI, blockchain, and machine learning talent. Future of the consumer, they embraced a participatory creation of products. Future of childhood, so they observed that the childhood concept of childhood, I guess, age is shrinking while the line between entertainment and education is blurring, which allowed them to create some more products that kind of were more educational as well as targeted towards young consumers. Future wellness, so specifically in certain markets, they had a healthy living strategic initiative. And then finally, with future of government, in 2019, they definitely recognized there was increased instability in various governments. And so they proactively created new government liaisons to continue to build those relationships. So overall, my thesis is that strategic foresight and its ability to plan for multiple potential futures really allows you to do greater innovation. And so this can involve early detection of signals for new business environments, doing trend research for the generation of new product innovations, prospect evaluation of those innovation ideas, and then exploring and developing the new businesses around those ideas itself, as well as bringing it back to your central initiative and then cross-functionally distributing those future-related issues and ideas. So speaking of innovation, now that we've talked about how Disney had that graphic designer who initiated the signals cards and then came up with all of these new products, which is what we do very frequently as UX and product designers, I wanted to connect design thinking with futures thinking, because I also believe that as designers, we're uniquely positioned to be able to be successful in bringing this to our company and being able to think in the new ways, those liminal ways required for futures thinking. We have a lot of pre-existing methods and skill sets that can help us be successful as futures thinking practitioners. So as we go into this section, I wanted to give a couple of definitions that will help you in the next question. So first off, strategic foresight. That's what we've been talking about a lot today, which is more the businessy end of futurism, the organizational, social, and personal practice that allows us to create functional and operational views of alternative futures and possibilities. But there's also design futures, which is more about bringing those ideas into an actual form of giving shape to those hypothetical possibilities, using our industrial design or graphic design skills to make them come to life. Then there's speculative design, which if you are familiar with design thinking's concept of wicked problems, those big societal problems like climate change or even the pandemic, it's a method of addressing those and looking towards the future by creating products and services for within those scenarios. And it does tend to be definitely on the border of design and art, in my opinion. And then finally, design fiction is the furthest away from the business end, closest to the art end of this field, which is more of a method of probing, exploring, critiquing possible futures. So rather than attempting to generate answers like strategic foresight or design futures do, it's rather attempting to formulate great questions to address those topics. So with that in mind, my next question to you is going to be, what kind of futurist are you? Where do you think you fall in this line? As we look at this, I hope you can use this to help you plot out yourself where you think your sensibilities lie closest to. So on an action versus imagination axis, as I was hinting at before, strategy, and especially traditional strategy, innovation management, tends to have the most incremental attitude towards change, that long now perspective of only wanting to cast out in the future 3 to 5 years. Whereas the most transformative attitude to change belongs to science fiction, like Netflix's Black Mirror. And this really focuses most on world building, involves speculative design and design fiction, where we're really focusing on creating provocative questions and interrogating the assumptions and the trends that led us to where we are today. And in this version of high to low action orientation, high to low imagination orientation, design thinking and strategic foresight are pretty far away from each other, over here and over here, respectively. However, I believe that this is the traditional way of thinking about it, and there actually is a way of bringing them closer together. So the traditional view of design thinking versus futures thinking is that design thinking tends to just start with one world, of course, and we make observations about the world, converge into insights, identify the user needs, and then reframe them so that we can continue narrowing down towards a single product or service, which we believe is the best thing to meet those needs. And then the traditional view of futures thinking is that we're starting from one world, but then we are diverging and diverging and diverging again until we have many, many future worlds, of which we're not making any kind of statement about which one is going to happen. We're just saying these are the array of possible scenarios. However, I do think it could be possible to bring them together. So futures thinking and design thinking have a lot of methods in common. And they also, even though they're focusing on different temporalities, have in common a way of bringing something to life, whether it's a future scenario or a single product or service prototype that fits into the world. As designers, it's often our job to be the creatives or the innovators in an organization. And futures thinking breaks down the limitations that we are often asked to focus on, so that we can imagine what it'd be like to design without the current limitations of technology, culture, or politics in mind. Futures thinking allows designers to stretch their imaginations and develop new and boundary-pushing systems and prototypes for the future. In other words, futures thinking is another method to help us innovate. Often we look at small issues, and futurism helps us to broaden the scope to tackle the biggest issues in society. It seeks to answer questions like, how should design impact the entire world? How can we design for a healthier ecosystem? And what can we do to influence the future culture of our organizations? As well as also answering, what don't we want to see from the future? So I think of this as a way of doing cross-training almost, like if you were an Olympic swimmer. Of course, you have to practice swimming, but maybe you also do some biking or weightlifting on the side. And that helps you develop your strength and speed so that when you come back to your main practice of swimming, you can be faster and stronger in the water. So that when we overlay design thinking and futures thinking, I believe it would be possible to first go through a futures thinking process to identify the possible, plausible, probable, and our preferable future that we want to aim towards, and then use the long now design thinking process to then prototype for a product or service that can meet the needs within that future that we're trying to move towards. So remember that while the futures mindset is important, as designers, design thinking and that process of coming up with a particular solution is how we take action in the world. And so the final mapping brings us to where design thinking, strategy, and futures thinking are all combined together in a version of design futures. So now I'm going to pause again and see what people in the chat are saying about where they fall on the mapping of these different subfields of futurism.
Sure. We had a lot of answers to the question, what kind of futurist are you? So Kay Lee said, foresight and transition design. Garrett said design futures and speculative design. Darwin said design futures. Bill said innovation management. Mark said, I'm a cranky futurist. Got some laughs. We also have some strategic foresight, strategy and design, etc. And one big question everyone would love to know is the source of that original Venn diagram of future thinking activities. Everyone would love to see more about that.
Let me see which Venn diagram. The very first one, not this one?
I think the one previous to this, because it came up before this one was shown.
Okay, yeah. I can definitely follow up with that. Maybe have the Austin Design Week team share that out.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I love how many different flavors there are of this field. And it's funny because actually Sheila and I, when we were first working on our futurism workshops together, had this conflict because I was actually much closer to the design fiction end of things, where I was just wanting to like, let's do a prototype of the future. Let's really make it real. And she was much closer to the strategic foresight end. So she just wanted to talk about, well, what's business value and like, how do we quantify like the possible value of each future to like success based on whatever metric. And so it took us a while to realize that we had different sub-interests and subspecialties. And so that was what was causing us to miscommunicate in our planning. Okay, so last section for all of you. Here is the part where I'm going to go through some of those workshop activities to actually enact the foresight process. So this is going to be a little bit dense. All right, we've already seen the 4 steps before: learning, anticipation, innovation, strategy. Definitely not going to read all of this in detail, but basically it goes in detail on what the different steps are within each of these phases of foresight. Of course, the first step is to choose your problem statement. And like I kept saying before, in design thinking, we talk about wicked problems, but we should definitely be able to feel free to choose a very broad problem statement for something as inherently broad as futures thinking. So a couple of examples would be something like the future of work, future of transportation, future of aging. Actually, I think AARP did this particular project. The future of the smart city, something that a couple of cities in, of course, the northern, like Scandinavian states have been working on, and also that my colleague Sheila did for Columbus, Ohio. And then, of course, after you choose your problem statement, then we move into the research phase, of which I think the most popular and really fairly easy to do process would be visual trend mapping. So you can take clippings from news or observations you see in the world around you, and then you organize them on what's usually nowadays a digital whiteboard. This kind of environmental scanning involves looking at the near view, so finding the immediate trends that are impacting your organization or your problem topic. You can also think of it as the things that are keeping your leadership awake at night. And the reason that you know about these environmental trends is because they're already taking place today. Then as we move into horizon scanning, think of this as more of the intermediate view. So this is kind of like if the first one, environmental scanning, is the skyscraper right next to you, then this would be the mountains in the distance. So they may look smaller, but in reality be even larger than the skyscraper. And then speculative scanning is thinking about gathering these clippings from the long-term view. So it's almost like you're looking for something that is behind the mountain, which you can't see right now. And so this is more of a guess of how big it would be. Examples of this, so if I were to look at environmental scanning, I read in the news today that a cyber truck was released, so an electrical truck. And so this would fall under the future of transportation, maybe even possibly future of energy. Horizon scanning might be thinking about what comes next after a Cybertruck. Maybe there are news somewhere which I'm not yet aware about for an electric powered airplane. And then speculative scanning, what if there's technology that doesn't actually exist yet, but could also feed into the future of transportation, such as if we found a way to do a nuclear reaction small enough to fit into an engine, and there could eventually be an atomic powered Cybertruck. After you gather, or even as you're continuing to gather your signals, we can start to put these together and synthesize them and analyze them into the STEEP forces. There's a bunch of other frameworks for this as well. I'm just going through this one. STEEP stands for social, technological, environmental, economic, and political forces. So based on the signals you've collected, then you can then categorize them into these different 5 categories, and then name the most important. And then also it's helpful to do the most uncertain macro forces that are affecting your chosen challenge. And then these would be your trends. So multiple signals gathered together into a category turn into a trend. And trends can also have a direction, such as electric vehicle usage is going up, as well as a strength. So if we were to say to compare electric bikes versus electric vehicles, you can start through their relative power to understand the amplitude of the trend. And then from there, as you have your trends, then you can then cast them into the future. So this is where we start to get maybe more creative. My favorite part as a design fiction fan. The couple of different directions would be growth of a trend, collapse of a trend, discipline, which is when it is forced by whatever reason to stay even, or utter transformation, which is always very fun because this is where you can throw more black swans in. And just as a reminder, black swans, those are the not very common, but extremely disruptive and often negative events. So for a growth trend casting exercise, if we take a particular trend, then what would the impacts be of this trend just vastly increasing in amplitude? And it could be for various reasons, going back to the steep forces, if something happened politically, like if President Biden had some kind of executive order or mandate to cause people to have to buy more Cybertrucks. It could be from a different direction, such as if something terrible happened in the environment to where nobody was willing to buy petroleum or gasoline anymore, then maybe that would force e-trucks to become more popular, so on and so forth. So you can see how the other trends can start to serve as reasonings for how a particular trend would be cast forward, either in growth, collapse, or any other direction. I won't go too much in detail for all the others. I think that kind of gets at how you go through this process. But of course, decline is what would be the impact of this trend just completely decreasing in amplitude. So for example, if Cybertrucks are banned. Discipline, so what would be the impacts of forces intervening to keep this trend steady? Say for some reason, it was forced to kind of slow down the growth, and then the number of electric vehicles on the road just stayed steady for the next 10 years. Or transformation, again, if something happened to where, I'm just going to make something up here, a volcano exploded and blocked out the sun. And so we didn't have solar energy anymore. And so then this, of course, affects not just the future of transportation, but many other things. And how would we respond to needing to still grow food and transport ourselves if we just didn't have the sun anymore? Okay, so now you have your trends, you have some ideas of how trends are interacting with each other. And then if we take that trend that you're going to say, let's just go back to electric vehicles as a growth trend, and you slap that in the middle of the futures wheel. And this is where you start casting out the primary, secondary, and then tertiary effects of that trend moving in that direction. So first order consequences is just what immediately follows. And then as you start to go further and further out to the web, secondary effects are the effect of the primary one, tertiary is the effect of the secondary, and so on. And so this allows us to explore the implications and impacts of our futures. It also stretches you to be more provocative and expands your minds to see the bigger picture. It helps to uncover unexpected consequences, as well as exploring connections between drivers. And this is also conveniently what provides you with a lot of the material for the next step, which is scenario building. So as you're casting different trends, and I don't know if I said this before, but this is an iterative process. You can't just do it one time. It would be expected that as you are casting one trend up, you cast another one down, and then this allows you to build up multiple possible scenarios, which you can then put together into a single scenario, commonly done in a 2x2. So for example, as you are gathering all of the consequences, then based on the implications of your chosen trend, you can plot them out in their relationship to each other, creating a title and description of each scenario, which often it falls into a framework of ideal, conventional, and fortress worlds, which sounds very exciting. But if we were to envision our preferred future based on all of these implications, how do we gather certain trends together to have the result which we want, which probably involves something like we all are still able to ship goods around the world, we're still able to travel, but also we start to have less of an impact on the environment. What trends need to converge in order to create those worlds? Conventional worlds are probably the most similar to today and relatively more boring or less sci-fi to work on. And then fortress worlds, those are the most dystopian worlds. So those are the ones that frequently have the most difficult things to deal with happening, but also fortress worlds are really important to plan for because it is planning for those negative scenarios that help us figure out how we would deal with them. And then as you have planned out multiple scenarios, then you can plot them into the cone of possibilities. As you might imagine, the most probable futures are probably tending to be the ones where the conventional worlds go, preferred futures as your most utopian ones, and then your fortress worlds might go somewhere around here. So as those high impact variables are identified and prioritized, then you can establish the range of how the variables are likely to play out over time. So that some futures are actually closer to the present day, and then some of them would be cast out into the long term as well. So the further ahead you go, then the wider the range of possibilities as well. And then my favorite type would be as you've identified those scenarios, such as the one where a volcano explodes and we do rely on electric vehicles, but maybe vehicles have to be completely transformed because they have to protect us from smoke and ash as we go between our homes and offices and the transportation. And so maybe we make a mock-up or sketch of what a car would be like in that world where it has to serve multiple other purposes that it doesn't serve today. The fun thing about diegetic prototyping, diegetic is a word that means inside the world. It's taken from movies or plays where, say, in a soundtrack, the soundtrack is from outside the world of the show, but the phone ringing comes from inside the world that the characters inhabit. And so this prototyping is taking place as if you were a designer of the future where that happened and you're having to design a car inside that scenario itself. The benefit of going through this process is that it really brings those scenarios to life so that as you're going back to your organizations and planning for the scenarios, they can immerse themselves in all of this research and all of this analysis and planning that you've done in order to best understand how to backcast how we get there, and then also what you do at different steps. So backcasting from future scenarios is kind of like the opposite of forecasting, where that's a much more traditional type of strategic planning, where we estimate if we need X widgets in the future, then how many parts of the widget do we need to make today? So forecasting is usually used to predict trends going forward as we expect them to, whereas backcasting is from that scenario, how do we plan for the unexpected variables that could get us there? And then finally, as we are planning out those different strategies for each scenario, then by analyzing the strategies that meet across multiple scenarios, we can prioritize the ones that leave the most options open. We can also prioritize the strategies that have the greatest impact. So to end, while the word future is commonly interpreted as a noun, Douglas Rushkoff says that it should be interpreted as a verb, not a noun. It can be used to describe not only a place in time at which we arrive, but also the process of proactively shaping change. How will you make the future that you want to see? All right, thank you so much for being here during this presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Maddie as some responses come in, and also if there's any other questions or comments in the chat. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm also always open to discuss this. So I'm going to turn it back over here now and open the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. There was so much great information in there, and the chat was really going the whole time. We have one question of what is the makeup of a futures team? We have some people who are on their own team. They're by themselves on a futures team, and it sounds like there's some other bigger ones. Do you have any ideas there?
Yeah, well, I can only speak from my experience at Accenture. Okay, I'm drawing memory here. I think the one that we came up with is you need one lead service designer, usually a business designer on the team. And then you might want to pull in a visual designer on a consulting basis to help out with creating some of the artifacts of the future, those prototypes or the templates for workshops. And then a lot of it is reliant on the subject matter experts of the topic itself. So at Accenture, it was possible because it's an enormous company, and so you can just tap someone on the shoulder to help out. But if you're also working with a client, I definitely think that relying on the experts of the client within the client organization is something that you can do to get that subject matter expertise. I would say that because this is a method and not necessarily attached to a particular industry, I think the important part is knowing the process itself. And then from there, you kind of learn as you're going through the research.
Awesome. And then we have another question here. How do you best integrate these kinds of social innovation processes, especially if you have limited access to recipients of the end deliverable?
Does the person who asked that want to come off mute and clarify?
Hi, Kelly. Great job. Thank you so much. Yeah, so if you have a limited understanding of the recipients of the final design that you're trying to create, say you're working remotely because of COVID or whatever, which of these tools would you suggest are best implemented within a social innovation framework in the first place? And then how do you go about doing that if you have very limited information about the end recipient?
And are you working on a strategic foresight or futures project right now?
Yeah, it kind of overlaps. So it's social innovation project, but we're designing it for the next 10 years. So then that goes into more of a speculative design arena, and strategically I'm trying to figure out how to best position ourselves to really make a viable case for what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think this kind of comes back to the different flavors of futurism, in my opinion, because speculative design, you don't really need to be in contact with the end users, but what both like design thinking or design futures coming to a specific solution, which sounds like you are, as well as even futures thinking, you kind of need to have the ability to do the full research contingent that is crucial to the process. And so maybe setting expectations about what they're getting might be part of your strategy, because if they just want you to go through the thought exercise, then that might be more of a speculative design flavor, where it's sort of an idea for a solution, but this isn't tested or necessarily de-risking based on specific evidence from the scenario they're trying to plan for. Whereas if they really are looking for something that helps to reduce risk or uncertainty, then I would say that you need like the direct research component of this process.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. So this one is from Dej. How have you seen future thinking and strategic foresight leveraged for cross-disciplinary R&D practices?
Yeah, I think that this is hard to answer because this is such a nascent field. In the case studies that I have seen, I've most often seen it more as a flavor of provocative thinking. So for example, when Dell actually came up with a futures project for different technologies of the future, it ended up being a series of short stories written by sci-fi writers. When different cities did like City of the Future things, they kind of came up with ideas and tested it against their populations of like, well, what do you think if we were to do this initiative for the city? But probably the best bet for an ongoing R&D initiative would be creating that database of signals, because depending on the specifics of that initiative, then at least you have that like big first step of work done. And then you can synthesize from that set of signals to whatever product or service you would like to come up with. But I do think that since it's so nascent, this isn't really a ongoing large part of many companies where we have published case studies of how people have actually turned it into real products. Now that I think of it, even if it were the case, I have a feeling they might not want to publish case studies because this is kind of a secret sauce.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you to everyone who participated in the chat and everyone who attended. So we have posted that survey in the chat. Please take it to provide a little bit of feedback, and then join our community on Slack where we'll continue the conversation. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.